Imagine returning to your high school reunion, only to be confronted by chilling secrets from the past. In tonight's video, we uncover 3 terrifying tales that will make you think twice about the people you thought you knew. Stay tuned, if you dare. The mysterious stranger named Connor. High school reunions, to most people, are the sort of occasion that comes with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. They're supposed to bring back memories, both fond and awkward, of a simpler time when the world felt smaller and futures were still open roads instead of narrow paths. For others, reunions are a chance to revisit the ghosts of the past, whether to bask in nostalgia or to exercise lingering regrets. But for me, they always felt more like an exercise in self-torment, a reminder of the person I never was, a misfit with no desire to reconnect with faces that I'd long since forgotten. I never intended to go to mine. In fact, the thought hadn't even crossed my mind. High school wasn't exactly something I look back on fondly. It wasn't a place where I'd forged lifelong friendships or even fond memories. It was more a series of days I survived, slipping unnoticed through the cracks of cliques and social hierarchies. There were no bonds worth revisiting, no grand accomplishments to be remembered for. So when the reunion invitation arrived, it went straight into a drawer, forgotten in the dim light of all the other things I had managed to file away from my high school years. Yet, despite my best efforts to avoid it, I found myself standing outside the grand catering hall where the reunion was being held, questioning every step that had brought me there. The invitation had arrived months ago, a small square card announcing the 10-year reunion for the class of 2010. At first, it hadn't even registered, just another piece of mail destined for the recycling bin. But then the messages began, old acquaintances suddenly resurfacing, tugging at a part of me that I hadn't realized still cared. "It'll be fun," they said. "Come on, it's been a decade. Don't you want to see everyone again?" I didn't. I really didn't. And yet, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I found myself agreeing. Maybe I thought I could slip in and out without much notice, just long enough to confirm that I had moved on and was better off without the ghosts of my teenage years. Maybe some deeply buried part of me hoped to see a face that remembered mine, to find a moment of connection I hadn't managed to find back then. Whatever it was, it dragged me to that hall against my better judgment. The building loomed in front of me, an ornate and over-decorated place that seemed determined to impress. The chandeliers inside gleamed too brightly, throwing distorted reflections across the polished floors, and the heavy curtains that lined the walls only added to the feeling of being trapped in a space that was trying too hard. I had hoped for something smaller, more intimate, a bar or a simple restaurant. Instead, it felt like the kind of venue where important events were supposed to happen, but the only thing it succeeded in doing was amplifying the strangeness of it all. I arrived late, hoping that by then the crowd would be too absorbed in conversation to notice me slip in. As I stepped through the doors, a wave of sound hit me, laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Familiar faces, older now but still recognizable, filled the room, though softened by the passing of years. Some of them had aged gracefully, time giving them a polished air of accomplishment. Others bore the quiet weariness of lives lived less glamorously, their eyes betraying the struggles hidden beneath their smiles. Yet, despite the faces I recognized, there wasn't a single flicker of recognition on theirs when they looked my way. It was as if I had never existed in their memories, a ghost from a past they hadn't even noticed had gone missing. I headed for the bar, my refuge for the evening. If I was going to endure this, at least I could have a drink in my hand. I ordered something I can't recall, and leaned against the counter, trying to blend into the background. The room buzzed with small talk and half-hearted laughter, but there was a strange hollowness to it all, as though everyone were playing a part in some unspoken drama. Conversations drifted in and out of earshot, snippets of lives I was never a part of. I watched as groups reformed, old cliques bonding over stories of their shared past, while others drifted from person to person, never lingering for too long in any one conversation. As I stood there, nursing my drink and watching the night unfold from a distance, I began to feel the weight of my own detachment. High school had never been a place of connection for me, it had been a place of survival. I had spent those years slipping through the cracks, avoiding attention, and now, 10 years later, it seemed I was doing much the same. The more I watched, the more it became clear that I didn't belong there. Whatever nostalgia the others were sharing, I wasn't part of it. I was just a stranger among familiar faces. It was just as I was contemplating leaving, wondering how soon I could slip out without anyone noticing, that he appeared. At first, I didn't even register his presence. He slid onto the bar stool next to me so quietly, so unobtrusively, that it was as though he had materialized from the shadows themselves. He was dressed simply jeans, a button-up shirt, nothing that would make him stand out. His face was the kind that you'd forget the moment you looked away. Yet, when I finally glanced at him, something in his eyes held me in place. They were dark, intense, and seemed to glimmer with a strange curiosity, as though he were studying me, waiting for something. Class of 2010, right? His voice was soft, casual, but there was something beneath it that made me uneasy, a tension I couldn't quite name. I nodded, my automatic response polite, even though I had no memory of him. His face sparked no recognition, no buried recollections from our shared years. Nothing about him seemed familiar, but he acted as though he knew me. "I'm Connor," he said, smiling as if that explained everything. "Transferred senior year. Don't expect you to remember me." I didn't. I wasn't even sure I believed him, but his smile was disarming, his handshake firm but cold, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I stayed. We began to talk, though the conversation felt strange from the start. He asked about my life, about what I had done since graduation, questions that seemed innocuous enough, but there was a precision to them, a kind of carefulness, as though he were cataloging my answers. I told him the usual about my job, where I live now, the surface-level details you give to someone you're never going to see again. But with each word, the conversation felt more like a transaction, as if I were giving him something intangible, something I wasn't sure I wanted him to have. There was something about Connor that unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. He smiled too easily, laughed at all the right moments, and yet there was a hollow quality to it, as though the emotion behind it wasn't real. His eyes, always fixed on me, held a strange intensity that made me feel like I was being dissected under a microscope. And yet, despite the growing unease, I couldn't bring myself to end the conversation. I stayed, letting it stretch on, feeling the weight of his presence like a shadow looming over me. At some point, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he asked for my phone number. It seemed harmless at the time. People exchanged numbers at these things all the time, didn't they? It wasn't unusual, just part of the ritual of reunion, an empty gesture meant to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Without thinking, I gave it to him, scribbling the digits onto a napkin that he slipped into his pocket with a smile. At that moment, it felt like nothing. Just another inconsequential exchange in a night full of inconsequential moments. But it wasn't nothing. The night wore on in a blur of half-hearted conversations and weak drinks, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Connor. He never seemed to stray far from the edges of the room, always lingering in my peripheral vision, always watching. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into the brief encounter, but the unease wouldn't leave me. It gnawed at the back of my mind, a quiet warning that I couldn't shake. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I should leave, the first text came. It was from an old classmate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The message was brief, but it sent a chill through me. "Hey, do you know that guy Connor? He's been weird all night. Be careful." I stared at the message, my mind racing. I hadn't mentioned Connor to anyone, hadn't even acknowledged his presence after our conversation. But now someone else had noticed him too, and the uneasy feeling that had been creeping through me all evening solidified into something sharper. I glanced around the room, scanning the faces for any sign of him, but I couldn't see him anymore. Yet, even in his absence, I could feel his presence, lurking just out of sight. Another text followed, this one from a different classmate. "He's been introducing himself with different names. Don't go anywhere with him. My heart began to race. The warnings coming from different people confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that something was very, very wrong. I needed to leave, but before I could make my escape, Connor appeared again, stepping out of the shadows as if summoned by my thoughts. His smile was still there, but it felt different now. Colder, more deliberate. "Hey," he said softly, his voice almost soothing. "Need a ride home?" The words were simple, innocuous on the surface, but they sent a jolt of fear through me. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to get away from him as quickly as possible, but I couldn't show fear. I forced a smile, nodded stiffly, and let him lead me out of the hall. The night air hit me like a slap, the cold cutting through the haze of the evening. Connor's car was parked near the edge of the lot, far from the streetlights, hidden in the shadows. Each step I took toward it felt like I was moving closer to some unseen danger, like a rabbit inching toward the mouth of a waiting predator. The ride was suffocating, the silence in the car thick with tension. Connor didn't speak much, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every movement, every breath. I gripped the edge of my seat, my pulse pounding in my ears as we drove through the dark, empty streets. We stopped at a red light, and in that moment, the fear that had been building in me finally erupted. "I think I'm going to be sick," I blurted out, my voice trembling. Connor's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time the smile faltered. There was a brief, chilling pause before he slowly pulled over to the side of the road. As soon as the car came to a stop, I bolted, flinging open the door and stumbling out onto the pavement. I didn't look back. I ran toward the nearest light I could see, a TGI Friday sign glowing in the distance. I didn't stop until I was inside, breathless and shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. The next day, my neighbor knocked on my door, her face pale and tight with worry. She told me that a man had been outside earlier, asking about me, asking if I lived there. She described him tall, dark-haired, unremarkable. Connor. I moved the next week, leaving behind no forwarding address. But even in this new place, far from the reunion, far from that night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. His face always just beyond the edge of my thoughts, his polite smile a haunting reminder that some encounters never really end. Even now, I can't quite shake the sense that, wherever I go, Connor will be there too.
I would tell that the watch was left here. There is a peculiar sort of curse that afflicts you and afflicts us, one that we rarely acknowledge until it becomes impossible to ignore. It's a curse of memory, a disease of the mind perhaps, or an ailment of the soul. This affliction involves the names, the faces, and the events from our past that never truly leave us. They haunt the periphery of our existence, like shadows just beyond the light, indistinct but ever present, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Time, it seems, only deepens the wound. The name Tyler was one such shadow, a name that had been absent from my thoughts for years, but never entirely gone. It was always there, somewhere in the recesses of my mind, hidden behind closed doors, waiting for the wrong moment to surface. It wasn't until the invitation to my high school reunion arrived, unbidden and unwelcome, that the past would reassert itself in the most grotesque of ways. 5 years, the words were printed in plain type, black and gold, as they stared up at me from the card that had been shoved through the slot in my door. The class of 2001 Times and reunion had read, "Come celebrate the time that's passed." 5 years, a fragment of time, small and insignificant to the world at large, but to me it was an eternity. The years since high school seemed like a different life, distant, like the fading echo of a dream. But when I read that card, when I saw the words, a cold shiver ran through me. Tyler, his name, slipped from the recesses of my memory, sharp as a knife, and it dragged with it all the unresolved dread I had thought was buried. I had no desire to attend the reunion. The very idea was anathema to me. I had built a life that had no place for the ghosts of high school, and certainly no place for him. The idea of seeing him again, of confronting the specter of my past in such a public way, but leading to a suffocating event. I had long since convinced myself that Tyler was a chapter in my life that was closed, and forgotten, or at least I had tried to convince myself of this. But the invitation, like some eldritch force, would not let go. It called me beckoning, with the same disquieting persistence that had once come from his presence, and despite my better judgment, I found myself inescapably drawn to it. My friends, ever the optimist, pleaded with me. It's been 5 years, people change, you can get closure, you'll see. It'll be good for you, closure. They had no idea the word was meaningless. Closure was a neat little lie, a comforting delusion that allowed you to pretend that the past could be neatly packed away, like old clothes in the back of a closet. But I knew better. There was no closure with Tyler. Tyler was not something that could be erased or filed away. He was a presence, something that lived and breathed in the dark corners of the mind, and it was this presence that I feared most. Still, I went. I had no real reason to, other than a vague sense of obligation or perhaps the faintest flicker of curiosity in a gorgeous t-shirt that I immediately regretted as I stepped into the rented banquet hall. It was a cold, sterile place of space that was neither celebratory nor comforting, really functional, as if it had been built with the exact purpose of needing as much lifelessness as possible. The room was adorned with the usual trappings of high school escapement and nostalgia. Balloons sagging from the ceiling, cheap streamers that fluttered in the artificial air, and a playlist of songs that were meant to evoke memories of a simpler time, yet only served to make a kicking on of it seem more hollow. Your brain both listening through and get ladders. The laughter of my classmates was a thin veneer, a brittle surface, masking something more unsettling underneath. And all the while, I might watch the door. I watched it like a man watches the horizon for a storm, waiting for a storm to break. Your advertised one. Don Binping. For the first hour, I managed to stay hidden in the periphery. I spoke in fragments with a few old friends, tried to make small talk, but all that felt insubstantial. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating as if I were standing in the middle of a vast empty space. All the walls pressing in at once, and always the door. I could not stop my eyes from flicking back to it, hoping, praying that I would not see him, that Tyler would not show up, that he would stay in the past where he belonged. But I knew, deep down I knew. Monday night, he was already here watching, waiting. And then there he was, standing by the bar, his back turned to me. Even from across the room, I knew him. His presence was as familiar and unnerving as a forgotten nightmare. The way he held his drink gripped too tightly. His posture slacked in that familiar, almost lazy way. Mot låsway så kan han sig mobbastangling till pavement. His dark hair hanging over his eyes, as if it were an extension of the shadows that clung to him. He hadn't changed. He was the same Tyler, and yet at the same time he would become something else. Something that was no longer entirely human. With that Aramis I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling. The room seemed to stretch and contract around me, and the laughter of the others became muffled, as though I were underwater, with one little socket under the pages. Through it, I wanted to leave. I should have left, but my feet felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the floor, and before I knew it, he had turned. His eyes locked with mine, and time seemed to stop. The world folded on itself. The years, the distance, the safety I had thought I had built, all of it disappeared in that instant. And I was 17 again, and caught in the web of his control. So his smile, slow and deliberate, spread across his face, as it was the same smile I had known. The smile that had once made my skin crawl, the smile that told me I was not in control, not then and certainly not now. The smile of a predator, and I felt it, the old familiar sensation of being watched, of being seen in a way that made every part of me recoil, as if I were nothing more than an object to be examined, to be consumed. I should have left, I should have slipped out of the room, out the door, and never looked back. But I didn't, and Tyler, as though sensing my hesitation, began to walk toward me. He moved through the crowd with little eyes, and eyes never leaving mine, as every step measured deliberate. The noise of the room faded, the world narrowing down to just him and me. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could hear it anyway so clearly, as though it made sounds in the universe. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body betrayed me. I was frozen in place, and my breath caught in my throat, as if I were already trapped. He reached me, and there between us grew thick with the weight of unspoken thing. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, too familiar. It was the voice of someone who knew me better than I knew myself. Long time no see. I swallowed, trying to steady my racing heart. Yeah, I said, it was feeling foreign on my tongue. It's been a while. He stepped closer. Too close. I could smell the alcohol in his breath, see the predatory gleam in his eyes as they flicked over me, sizing me up, calculating. I wanted to pull away to push him back, but I couldn't move. The space around us seemed to warp, and for a brief moment, the whole room felt like a dream, a twisted reflection of reality. I was standing on the eye of a storm that I had no hope of escaping. Your character is unforgived on it, I'm a reflection. He's found. Over 10 lights of the shiver. I was known to catch up with it hovered on the sag rock note and his voice, a light too smooth, too clanging, too clear, just the two of us. We got a lot to talk about. She had this. I wanted to refuse, I wanted to shout, to scream that I had nothing to say to him. My voice failed me. I could only shake my head, my mouth dry, my thoughts spinning. I don't think that's a good idea. But I feel like you your temple. For me, his smile faltered just for a moment. And I saw the flash of anger in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. A reminder of the darker, more dangerous side of him that I had known all too well. But then it was gone, replaced by something colder, something more insidious. Come on, he said, his tone hard now, the smoothness replaced by a quiet insistence just for a few minutes. Before I could protest further, his hand shot out and seized my arm. The pressure was unyielding, almost painful. I could feel the heat of his fingers through the fabric of my sleeve, like a brand, like something that would never be erased. A panic surged through me, an old fear that I thought I had buried long ago. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened impossibly strong. But let go of me. I managed to choke out, my voice louder than I intended, but still, it felt as if I were shouting into a void, unheard, unused by anyone else. Therefore, amazing for a fleeting moment, I thought he wasn't going to let go, that he was going to drag me from the room, drag me back into the nightmare of high school where no one would even notice. But then, as if sensing the principality to be beast me, his eyes flicked briefly to the onlookers, and the smile returned colder this time, calculating. We'll talk later, he murmured, his voice low, dark with promise, before turning and vanishing back into the crowd. Stood there, trembling, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The room spun, the conversations around me a blur, and the rest of the night passed like a dream that I couldn't wake from. Every time I looked around, I half expected to see Tyler watching me, his eyes hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next moment when I would be vulnerable when he would strike again. When I left that night, I did so in a daze, the weight of his presence lingering long after I had stepped out into the cool night air. I thought foolishly that it was over, that I could go back to my life and never think about him again. But Tyler had other plans. It started with text. With the text. By text, it started with a text. A text was actually posted. At TNI and beyond, at first they were harmless enough. Simple inquiries, questions like, how have you been? Or I miss you. They were easy to ignore, but then they began to grow more insistent, more desperate. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk. He apologized that he was sorry for everything, that he missed me. But when I ignored him, when I didn't reply, his tone shifted. The messages became more frequent, more manipulative. They became demands. And when I blocked his number, he found new ways to contact me, new accounts, new numbers. He was relentless. His presence became a sickness that spread, suffocating every part of my life, a constant reminder that he was really always there. But I mean, little contrast. And then came the knocking, and he reapproximated. And when I fertilized a faint, a soft rhythmic tap on my door, barely perceptible, I thought it was a trick of my mind, an echo of the fear that had taken root in me, but then it came again and again, and every night without fail. The same rhythmic knock, tap, 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 always at the same hour, the witching hour, the hour when everything feels fragile, and the boundary between the known and the unknown is thin, paper thin, and I could feel it. I could feel his presence, standing just beyond the threshold, waiting, watching. I never opened the door, never looked outside, but I knew it was him. The fear settled deep into me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. It became something that I lived with, that I carried with me everywhere. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every night I lay awake, my mind consumed the sound of that knock. Flew like tapping, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something I could not understand, something inevitable. I couldn't escape it. It couldn't do it. Finally, I went to the police. I filed a report, told them everything. They reassured me, told me they would handle it, but they didn't understand. Tyler was not someone who responded to the rules. He was staying outside of them. Outside of that, he was not bound by the law, by society's constructs, by any semblance of order. The first time the knocking stopped, the text stopped, Tyler disappeared, but I knew it wasn't over. It never is. Never will be. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still hear the tapping, a faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. From somewhere in the distance, it echoes in my mind, like a clock winding down, a reminder that Tyler is always watching, always waiting. And deep down, I know it will never end. Not ever. Not until he gets what he wants.
The Reunion of Shadows. I have often wondered if there's a point in time where the self begins to unravel, a moment when the idea of you, the person you think you are, becomes merely a construct, an illusion. This thought, like a dark undercurrent, had been with me long before I received the invitation, but it had remained a distant hum in the background of my life. I never expected it to fully surface, to take on such horrible clarity, until that reunion. Phoebe, or at least the woman I knew as Phoebe, had emerged from the past like a ghost, her name barely recognizable in the dusty corridors of my memory. She spoke of a reunion, a chance to reconnect with people I hadn't seen or thought of in years, people who, for all intents and purposes, may as well have been dead. There was something curious in her voice, a tone of urgency that I tried to ignore but couldn't. I don't know why I accepted her invitation. Nostalgia? Curiosity? No, it was something else, something darker. A sense that I needed to know what had happened to the faces that had once populated my past, or perhaps more frighteningly, to see what had happened to me. The house, the place where this reunion was to occur, loomed ahead of me that night like a living thing, its shape monstrous against the black sky. It was far larger than I had imagined, sprawling and labyrinthine, as though it had grown, consumed by some malignant force. There was nothing welcoming about it, no lights in the windows, no warmth in its contours. Even from the outside, it felt like a place that was out of sync with the world, a structure that had no business existing in this reality. Stepping inside was like stepping through a veil, one that separated the world of the living from something else. I had expected the usual signs of festivity, laughter, conversation, the warmth of old friends, anything that would hint at the reunion Phoebe had promised. But instead, there was only silence, thick and oppressive, hanging in the air like a shroud. The walls seemed to close in around me, the very architecture of the house twisting in ways that should have been impossible. The room stretched and contorted, their angles wrong, their proportions too large and yet too small at the same time. It felt like the house was playing tricks on my perception, bending reality to its will. The guests were scattered throughout the space, but they were not the people I remembered. Their faces, though familiar, were distorted, aged not by time, but by something far more insidious. Their skin hung loosely on their bones, their eyes sunken, hollow. They moved about with a kind of mechanical precision, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as if they were puppets being guided by unseen hands. And yet, as grotesque as they were, there was something worse, something more terrifying about the way they looked at me. Their eyes, glassy and vacant, followed my every movement, as if they were waiting for something. At first, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Time changes people, after all. Decades had passed since I last saw these faces, and surely the years had not been kind to any of us. But the more I watched them, the more I realized that time had not changed them. It had hollowed them out, leaving only the shells of what they once were. Their conversations, if you could call them that, were fragmented, broken sentences that floated through the air, disconnected from any real meaning. They spoke, but their words seemed to dissolve the moment they left their mouths, like echoes in a void. I wandered through the house, moving from room to room, trying to find some corner where I could collect my thoughts, where I could escape the suffocating presence of the other guests. But the house seemed to stretch on forever, its corridors twisting and multiplying, each turn leading to another impossible passageway. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. It was as if the house was alive, shifting around me, trapping me within its bowels. At some point, I found myself in a dimly lit room that felt different from the others. The air was heavier here, more oppressive, and there was a staleness that clung to everything: the furniture, the walls. Even the light itself seemed tired, as if it had been struggling to illuminate the room for centuries. In the center of the room stood a figure, a man, his back turned to me. I couldn't see his face, but there was something in the way he stood, rigid, unnatural, that filled me with a sense of dread. When he finally turned to face me, I wished he hadn't. His features were distorted, as though his face had been smeared, his eyes too wide, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that never touched the rest of his expression. He stared at me for a long moment, and I felt as though I were being dissected, as if he were peeling back the layers of my mind, searching for something hidden within me. "You don't belong here," he said finally, his voice low and hollow, like the creaking of old wood. "None of this is real." The words struck me like a blow. Of course, none of this was real. How could it be? This place, these people, they were all wrong, all out of sync with the world I knew. And yet there I was, standing in the middle of it, unable to leave. "You need to get out," the man continued, his smile widening into something grotesque. "Before it's too late." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed up, my body frozen in place. The man's smile faltered for a moment, and his expression shifted into something darker, more predatory. "She isn't who you think she is. None of them are." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment I felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of clarity cutting through the fog that had settled over my mind. I turned to leave, but the room had changed. The door I had entered through was gone, replaced by a wall that seemed to pulse and breathe, as though the house itself were alive, watching me. I stumbled back into the corridor, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The house had become a maze, its walls shifting and contorting with every step I took. I could hear the other guests behind me, their footsteps echoing through the halls, growing closer with each passing second. They were coming for me, I realized, though I didn't understand why. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away. But no matter how fast I moved, the house stretched on, its endless corridors winding and twisting around me, leading me deeper into its labyrinthine depths. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, until I was forced to crawl, my hands scraping against the cold, damp floor. I don't know how long I crawled through that nightmare, but eventually I found myself in another room. This one was smaller, more intimate, but no less disturbing. In the center of the room stood a table, and seated around it were the guests, the people I had once known, now reduced to grotesque caricatures of themselves. They looked up at me as I entered, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths twisted into eerie, unnatural smiles. "You've been away for too long," one of them said, though I couldn't tell who. "It's time for you to come back." I tried to respond, to tell them that I didn't belong here, that I needed to leave, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth moved, but no sound escaped. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls bending and warping, as if the entire house were collapsing in on itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I was standing outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, its doors closed. I had no memory of how I had escaped, no recollection of the last moments I had spent inside. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I drove for hours, the road stretching out before me in an endless, empty line. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left. That something, some part of that place had followed me, lurking just beneath the surface of my mind. In the days that followed, I tried to forget, to push the memory of that night into the recesses of my mind. But it was impossible. The faces of the guests haunted me, their hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows. And Phoebe, no, Claire, she lingered in my thoughts, her voice a constant whisper at the edge of my consciousness. I tried to find her, to track her down, but it was as if she had never existed. Every trace of her had vanished, leaving only the faintest echoes behind. I dug deeper, searching for some record of her, some proof that she had been real, but there was nothing. Just a name, floating in the void, attached to nothing and no one. And the house, oh, the house. It had vanished too. Thank you all for watching and supporting the channel. Your support is a great motivation for us to keep making interesting videos. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon. Soon.